All right, guys, we are at video number 4 in this 4-part series of the pros and cons of working with a big tech company versus a small startup. If you have stuck with a series this long, thank you very much and congratulations to you. I hope that we have learned a little bit about, sort of the decision making between working at a bigger company and at a smaller company. Today, we're going to be talking about the cons of working at a small startup. Excited to get into this one. So let's do it. Okay, so the first item, and this one will not be a surprise to you if you've been watching these videos. The first con of working for a small startup is that they move too fast. And what do I mean by that? I mean that everybody's in such a rush to get to the goal, right? Whether the goal is a certain amount of revenue or the goal is an IPO, whatever the case is, more financing. That people are just willing to make snap decisions without putting much thought into them. We've talked about the pros of companies that move really, really fast like this. And so the cons of this is that oftentimes the decisions that are made aren't great. Many times they end up adding unnecessary workload to your team's plate. And sometimes they produce outcomes that are not great for your customers either. And it's because there just wasn't a lot of planning or thoughtfulness put into the decision. Oftentimes, upper management or upper leadership, I should say, will make very large company-wide decisions very fast without much thought into, how is this at a granular level going to affect the team and affect our goals and our metrics. I don't have to go into why this is a con, right? It can be frustrating that your job is being made harder simply by a lot of sort of thoughtless decisions happening in an effort to move fast. Indeed, you will break things. And while that sort of innovation and experimentation is something that is central to working at a small startup and is super, super important, yeah, for sure, it can make the job a lot harder. Okay, so the next con to working at a small startup is oftentimes there are really no processes or systems in place when you get there, especially if you're the first person hired in that role or in that department. Maybe you're the first person of that role in your region or on your continent, whatever the case may be. A lot of times there's really no structure in place. There are certain personality types that can thrive in that sort of environment. And then there's a certain personality types that can't or just don't want to, which I think is fine too. Not everybody is good at creating their own structure, and not everybody wants to create their own structure. And so when really there are no guidelines around how things should be done, there are lots of small frustrations throughout your everyday that could be avoided if someone would just put some processes in place. And so sometimes it can be fun, like I was talking about in my last videos about, it can be fun to create these processes and systems. It can make you feel like you have more autonomy over the role. But it can also be really frustrating at times where you just need to get something simple done. And it is way more chaotic than it needs to be because nobody knows what they're supposed to be doing. And there's no real communication or tribal history to fall back on where this is concerned. And so those times, those really startup days, right, can be really, really frustrating, especially if you're someone who's maybe more senior in your role or in your position, and maybe you are not the type of person that enjoys creating order out of chaos. Maybe a small startup wouldn't be the place for you, to be totally honest. Okay, so this next con is a little something that is called shiny object syndrome. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It is a company that is distracted by every good idea that they hear or see on TV or hear about on LinkedIn. And they're like, oh, we should start this new initiative. Oh, now we should work on this project. Oh, I heard such and such company was doing this. We should do that too. And it's sort of just chasing the shiny object, chasing the thing of the moment, the shiny object of interest. Again, without a lot of thoughtfulness and also without taking time to think is this actually going to move the needle for anyone? Will it move the needle for us as a company, for our investors, for our customers? Will anyone actually see real value in doing this? Or did I just hear about this or think about this and become obsessed with it and want to force my team to do it, right? This is something this does happen at larger companies too. But again, in that rush to be the first to market or to get to your IPO or to make a certain amount of revenue, people are experimenting and trying everything that they see and hear. But the truth is that most ideas are not workable. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? It's sort of a numbers game. You do have to be willing to try things, but just because you have an idea that sounds good or feels good doesn't actually mean that it's going to move you any closer to your goals. And there's a lot of small startups that don't really understand. They feel like, leadership feels like if they have been struck with inspiration, then that means this is something that we all need to drop what we're doing and pay attention to and divert all of our energy to. But what about the last 20 ideas that you told us we had to divert all our energy to? Are we still doing those things? Do those things still matter? We've moved on to something different. So oftentimes these small companies will have just a trail of half-finished, abandoned projects and initiatives that everybody was really excited about for a few days or a few weeks, and then we kind of moved on to the next thing. Maybe some people will not find this to be too much of a con. For me, I found it really, really hard. Sort of that lack of focus makes it hard to complete deep work and, get really substantial work on a certain project done when you're always just bouncing from one thing to another. I would say that's not really how my brain works and not how my preferred workflows are. So I found this to be really hard. But honestly, I have worked with a lot of people who didn't really mind it. So kind of depends on the person. Okay, so the next con that I want to talk about of working with a small startup, less stability. Now, there's a lot of different ways in which I mean this. Less financial stability, in that, even if you've got a small startup that does have funding and cash in the bank, the powers that be are always counting down the days till that cash runs out. I think that inspires a lot of anxiety and leadership in those companies because their ability to manage cash flow is ultimately going to be the thing that decides whether they, pass or fail, live or die. And so there's definitely just a feeling of more uncertainty in terms of things changing all the time, like I just mentioned with shiny object syndrome, but also financially things changing all the time. I've worked at a number of startups that kind of swing wildly between hiring as fast as they can and laying off as many people as they can. And instead of just finding this sustainable middle path, I feel like there's often these sort of binge and purge cycles with finances, these spending and then extreme saving cycles because we spend too much. That creates instability, it creates feelings of anxiety and stress, I think, which gets passed down to you in your role. Also, smaller startups tend to have higher turnover. Now, at the bottom of the totem pole and just sort of regular IC roles, independent contributor roles, this may or may not be a big deal. It may or may not be a big deal, but this often happens quite a bit at like the executive level. You will have execs coming in and out all of the time. Typically, an executive is a big, expensive hire. They are meant to have a lot of influence over the direction of the company, especially a small startup. And so to have them leave often abruptly can be kind of very shocking, jarring to the system, and in some cases traumatic if you have been working on very deeply on a particular thing that person was leading, and then they just from one day to the next they're gone, and all of your work from the last couple months is now meaningless. And now I guess we're going to switch to the next thing. That kind of lack of stability is what I mean. There's some fun and there is some risk-taking involved with things changing all the time that can be a little bit exhilarating. And then there's the other side of it that can just be anxiety-inducing, and that you can wake up every day, any day, and have no idea that maybe half your team is about to get fired. And look, guys, layoffs and stuff like that happen at big companies too. I don't want to, lie to you and say that they don't. However, this lack of stability, right? This general high highs and low lows are a particular feature, I think, of smaller companies that can be a little bit much if that's not what you signed up for. Okay, before we get into the final, and I would say definitely the biggest con of working for a small startup, do me a favor, like, subscribe, hit the bell icon. I post new content here every week. You don't want to miss that. So the biggest con of working at a small startup, and this one you guys will notice with me as a big theme, a lack of work-life balance. Oof. To me, that is the absolute worst part of working for a small startup. First, there's the, we talked about this a little bit in my previous videos about, the boundaries of your role sort of being ambiguous and changing all the time because everybody has to wear many hats. It's a small, scrappy team, an agile team, whatever cliche you want to use. And so everybody's got to be willing to do everything. That in itself creates more anxiety and less work-life balance. But then also there's literally less work-life balance because there's just less people. And so, if someone takes a vacation, you may feel that workload falling directly on you, right? Not only are you working full week, but now you're working somebody else's full week. It makes you more hesitant to take time off because you're aware that people are literally going to have to do your job while you're not there. Typically, leaders in the small startup space are at the point where they're laser focused on a specific objective and they have no work-life balance at all. They don't take time off. They are working nights and weekends and federal freaking holidays. They're on Slack at 1 a.m. And that sort of energy and the precedent that sets gets transferred down the ladder all the way to you. So I talk about work-life balance a lot. And the thing is poor work-life balance is kind of like a contagion and that it spreads. One person does it and then other members of their team do it and then members of other teams do it. And before you know it, you have an entire company where everyone is drowning in work all the time and trying to prove that they are not the weak link. This is super common in small startups. It just comes from having more work and less people to do that work. It also is fed by this shiny object syndrome, by this idea that we can try a million different half-baked ideas at one time and everybody should just do all of that. And again, you don't ever want to be the weak link, right? You don't want to be the person that is like, oh, should we really be working on Labor Day? Because if your boss is working on Labor Day and his boss is working on Labor Day and your teammate is working on Labor Day, it's like, okay, I guess we're working Labor Day. And, I had a boss tell me one time that, they needed people at the company who were 200% committed, not just 100%. If that puts it into perspective, the kind of mindset that some of these people are in trying to build startups. Hey, look, if you don't mind work being your entire life, more power to you. I enjoy having work-life balance. And so for me, it's kind of an absolute deal breaker. That said, we have talked about some of the pros of working at a startup and the amount of rapid career growth you can experience, and also many times very competitive salaries that you can get working. The price that you pay for that typically is chaos and less work-life balance. Okay, guys, that's it. I hope you've enjoyed this series. I'm going to be doing a couple more of these. Leave me a comment. Let me know what you thought of the series, and also if you've experienced any of these pros and cons, I'm sure you have, working at a small or a large company. It doesn't even have to be in tech. I would still love to hear from you. All right, guys, that's it. I'll see you in the next one.